Well, good morning. It's been an interesting morning so far, and I want to welcome our guest with us this morning, Peter Lamb and Laura. Oh, hi, Laura, from the Agency of Ag.
No, natural research.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, have you been up to our town dump lately, our stump dump?
Not lately, but
It's all
I
covered
understand.
with snow, you wouldn't see a thing.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, good morning, and we wanted to chat a little bit about the solar panels, and we've had some people in people that develop solar power, and they were asking basically about putting solar panels near farmers' fields or in their fields, and what they run across is they're classified in different spots of being wetlands. And so they, of course, want to be able to put their solar panels in there, even though they're wetlands. And farmers have problems dealing with the wetlands on their farms, what they can do and can't do. And we wanted to get your opinions on if you may have been working on this already with those developers, and where you folks are with that situation. So I don't know, Laura, if you want to start first, or Peter, if you want to start.
I'm happy to give a brief overview, Chairman Starr, if you'd like, and then I'll turn it to Laura for the details, if that's all right.
Yeah, that would work for us.
Perfect, thank you. Well, good morning, Chairman Starr and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Pete Laflamme. I'm the manager of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC, and the division includes a number. We have 8 different programs, but the programs of interest, our wastewater program, our stormwater program, our CAFO program, and then our 3 major resource programs: lakes, rivers, and of course wetlands. And with me this morning, as you see, is Laura LaPierre, the manager of our state wetland program. And as you know, Laura's program issues permits for activities in certain wetlands, those class 2 wetlands, wetlands of significance here in Vermont. Those are wetlands that are determined to be significant for their functions and value. And Laura is going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The program operates under the authority of state statute and our subsequent rules, the Vermont Wetland Rules. Those rules, as I'm sure you've heard, have been the subject of a lengthy stakeholder process to evaluate potential changes to those rules to increase their efficiency and transparency. And representatives of the solar industry, some of the folks that you've had an opportunity to speak with, have been part of that stakeholder group. And to your point, Chairman Starr, we've also had several meetings over the past few years with representatives for solar development. We have also issued permits for certain portions of solar development within wetlands, and those projects are up and running today. So we have had those conversations. We have said to the solar industry that if they were desiring to come into the legislature and work on an exemption similar to the agricultural exemption for growing food and crops within wetlands, if the solar industry wanted to initiate that, which I sense they have, we would be happy to work with you and with them on that language, and concerns, better be able to express our concerns for that sort of activity within wetlands. But I'll now turn it over to Laura to discuss more specifically the wetland permitting process and how that, limits development within those significant wetlands.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Laura?
Thank you. Good morning, Senators. For the record, my name is Laura LaPierre. I'm the Program Manager for the State Wetlands Program in the Department of Environmental Conservation. I have a handout that I sent you guys, and I can see about sharing that real quick to give you guys an overview of the program in general. Okay, so like Pete was saying earlier, wetlands provide functions and values for the landscape and people of Vermont. Specifically in statute, we protect wetlands for these 10 functions and values. They have, in some cases, ways for you to evaluate those monetarily, like for flood damages, for the Middlebury flooding from Irene. And then also I have some statistics up here of, how there's a very high concentration of biodiversity and species use within wetlands. In agricultural settings, wetlands are more often used for hayland or pasture if they're growing food and crop, typically not an area that you would grow corn because it would be stunted. And those areas more commonly provide flood control or water quality protection for significant functions if they have significant functions. So wetlands scientifically are areas that are inundated or saturated for at least 14 days of the growing season, which is starting very soon. And we evaluate whether the area has these 3 parameters, whether there's wetland soil, water-loving plants, and signs of water. Statutorily, if a wetland is not considered a wetland if it is growing food and crop in connection with farming activities. So that's where the exemption lies. When the wetland is considered a state wetland, it has a protected buffer zone if it is classified as class 1 or class 2. Class 1 wetlands, we only have 11 of those in the state. They are exceptional, and we rarely permit for impacts within those areas. Class 2 wetlands have 1 or more significant functions and values, so they warrant protection, and they have a 50-foot buffer zone. When we go to review permit applications for Class 2 wetlands, we look at the mitigation sequence. So we're trying to ensure that there's no undue adverse impact to those wetland areas. And we look for avoidance of those wetlands. Can you avoid? If you can't, we ask if there can be minimization of impacts to those areas. Can you restore some of those short-term impacts? And then thirdly, if there are harms to functions and values, the area needs to have some sort of compensation. So that's a big part of what our program does. And we also help with incentivizing voluntary restoration through the NRCS's Wetland Reserve Easement Program. We have incentive funds for farmers to get easements and restore portions of their farmland, and they receive monetary benefits for doing that.
I noticed on that diagram, Laura, that you've issued over 200 permits.
This year, yes.
And what, do you have any idea what the bulk of those permits were for? Were any of them for farming or solar or?
There were a few related to farming and a few related to solar. The bulk of them are new home sites is something that's really becoming more prevalent in Vermont as new home sites. I can tell you, I have statistics for our review of solar projects in Vermont. We've reviewed over 580 solar projects in the past 8 years, and we've permitted 60 solar projects in those past 8 years. The typical things that we're permitting is access roads to cross the wetland so that the solar farm can be in the available upland space. There are a few that the arrays are within the wetland area. And there's also some cases where some trees had to be cut to deal with shading issues on the panels. So what we're looking at is around 10% of all solar projects are needing wetland permits under our current design of the program.
So 10% of the total of the projects are dealing with wetlands?
Correct.
And why would they come in and ask for a different operation, or they want to do away with permits, or are they costing them a lot of money? Why would they come in and want to ask us to help alleviate the permitting for solar and or use them the same as farmers have for putting up solar if they can get permits?
Well, there have been several instances where the solar project had to shrink its design to avoid wetlands. Several cases where they've moved the entire location of the solar farm. And that's a part of just figuring out where to site the solar project in an area that's not wetland. I can assume that that's what they're getting at, is they'd like to just be able to develop in those areas, but it'd be better to ask Encore that as a follow-up question, perhaps.
Got it. My sense is Laura's talking about, giving them access through a wetland to get to a field, that they would rather have it be an allowed use, not that, I don't know if that means they don't ever get a permit, but that it would be a default yes, if here's how you may develop in a wetland, as opposed to the exception getting a permit.
See, farms or people that own wetlands, they can drive across wetlands to get to their farm. But I don't know if driving a tractor and a combine or a wagon with a load of feed in it would weigh the same as a truck hauling solar panels. I don't know personally. I don't have a clue on if they come by tractor trailer, come by train, and then they're offloaded But
these are one, you know, you
it's
don't
one
repeatedly,
trip.
yeah, or one installation and,
Yeah.
but.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Yep. So in regards to the accessing the site, they actually look to fill in the wetland to create a road in those instances. So that's where we're issuing permits. Some of the other impacts might be that they're doing vegetation management. So they still need to, on the long term, be able to cross that wetland to do mowing within the solar array. I listened in on Friday's discussion, and I understood there were a lot of questions or some questions about the farming exemption and allowed uses. So I wanted to just take a moment to give a brief overview of that. So like I stated earlier, areas that have the 3 parameters, soils, water-loving plants are considered wetland scientifically. If the area is used to grow food or crop, it's exempt from the wetland rules. So in this image here, we have an area that's been in pasture since before the rules were set into place, which was 1990. And since it's been pastured and it's being grazed, it's considered an exempt wetland. Now that same wetland may extend outside of the pastured area like it does in this little sketch. And in this case, it's in a forested area. Maybe it's providing important wildlife habitat. So that area outside of the pasture is protected wetland and it receives a 50-foot buffer zone. There is an expiration to the exemptions when the area is no longer able to grow food and crop. It's something that needs to receive a permit if you're impacting that wetland. So this example here is an access road. If you're putting an access road through this wetland, you can't graze in that area anymore. So that area needs to have a permit. There's also other exemptions for maintaining existing structures and facilities. So if that access road was there since 1989 as well, it can remain, it can be maintained and such. So thinking of the scenario of a solar array, if you were to put a solar array into this exempt wetland area, you would need to get permits for the access road. You need to get a permit for where those posts are going. They need to understand whether you can just drill a post in or if the post is going to fall over, because that happens sometimes in saturated soil where you might need to have a larger ballast to hold that area. And the square footage of those impacts is what would be applied for a wetland permit. Say if you have that area as solar for 20 years, that area that wasn't growing food and crop is no longer an exempted wetland. You take the solar panels off that site. They've been maintaining it as grassland, essentially. So we do have an allowed use for growing food and crop, so long as you're not draining or filling that area. So in those instances where the solar panels are removed and now it's still herbaceous wetland, it can be used for food and crop again. However, if that area grew up as woody and you needed to cut down a shrub layer or a forest layer, that would be a conversion that would require a permit.
Chris has a question, Laura.
Yeah, so you said if they're maintaining as grassland, that would, is that a way that you could have solar and maintain it as ag land? So if you wanted to take the panels out after 20 years, you could continue to farm on that land?
I'm saying that for the 20 years, you can just keep it as solar. And then when you remove the panels, if it's grassland, it's an allowed use to grow food and crop in that area. So it loses the exemption in that case.
Well, wait, but it's, if you're growing food or crops, it is exempted, right? So this is, I actually think this will be the complicated part of any solution is if a farmer is, if there's some relaxed or understood permission to put solar in wetland, but that means that after that, excuse me, the farmer gives up the exemption and the ability to grow food, then it'll be a problem and you won't in fact install solar. So can you tease that out? Because I hear you saying conflicting things. If you've got solar and you're growing grass or grazing animals, and then 20 years goes by and you remove solar, have we now changed what is permittable in that area?
Yes, so the exemption is for areas growing food and crop or an ordinary rotation. Taking it out of growing food and crop for a 20-year time period is not ordinary rotation. And you would lose that exclusion from the statute, but there's a mini exemption that's in the rule that still would potentially apply. Where those panels are removed, the area is herbaceous. You don't need to do any large earth sculpting in order to plow and plant and remove hay from the area again. And that is something that's an allowed use under the wetland rules. They still need to get a permit to do the solar part. But for just, cutting hay again in that area, that would still be allowed afterwards under our current rule.
So,
Do this, but grazing.
yeah. Laura, what if a dairy guy switched to a different commodity and diversified and had vegetables someplace and corn on the, all kinds of veggies, and they also bought some sheep and they grazed that land? Would that be considered at the end of the lease or the termination of it? Would that still then be considered agricultural lands?
So are you saying they are doing agriculture in and around the solar panels?
Yes. Sheep could, they're a lot smaller and they could graze in with the panels. And would that, if that was allowed by the solar company, would that keep that land open for ag in the future?
Yeah, potentially. I don't know how good a wetland is for sheep, but someone else would need to look into that.
Yeah, Pete, did you have any comments on that?
No, we heard that from the solar industry as well, the sheep under the panels idea. Again, we said we'd be happy to look at that in further detail with them. I mean, I think it's going to be more site specific, as Laura said. Maybe there are certain instances where that would work. It probably depends on site specific factors. Just going back to the exemption versus allowed use too, I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, that right out of the gate for ag lands that were in production as of 1990 when the rule came into effect, there's that clear exemption. And there's also differently and separately within the rules an allowed use for growing food and crops in wetlands that also exists. So there's sort of two different ways of getting to the same end result. If it comes out of ordinary rotation, the exemption goes away. But then if it's a grassed wetland and no cutting or stumping is required to convert that back to growing food and crops, that is an allowed use within the rules. There's also a third way, which is to get a permit to convert land to a wetland to an agricultural use. That has to meet the same three steps in the process that Laura spoke about earlier. Looking for alternatives, looking for minimization, and then finally providing compensation. So that third way is the more difficult of the three, but there are those three. There are subtle differences, but they are different. So
yeah. And if a solar company or the landowner had to get a permit, what these guys were talking about was to be economically good. It almost sounded to me like a 10-acre plot would be that's the size they really like to make it economically feasible. A 10-acre piece of land, basically a big piece of land. And, for somebody that doesn't know how big 10 acres is, it's hard to see, well, that's not very much, but that's a lot of fencing and a lot of cost. And it would, I guess they fence the whole area. So with a chain link fence and so how much does a permit, would you say, cost for a 10-acre parcel where there's wetlands on the map, there's indications of a class 2 wetlands on, it chases around a field. How much would a permit, is it by the acre or how do you determine that?
It's by the square foot of impacts, like any other project. We have administrative fee of $240. Then it's 75 cents per square foot of wetland impact and 25 cents per square foot of buffer zone impact.
See, we got, I think maybe Laura, you were in on it when a farmer up my way was putting in a pipe to push manure from the farm to the fields with a big 8 or 10 inch pipe, and they were going to have to either through the edge of a wetlands, or they were going to have to reroute and put the pipe around it, and it was an ungodly amount of money that he was going to have to pay to go through his own land because it was classified as a wetlands to put the pipe in. And I think, well, I know we got that straightened out by not only a temporary disturbance to a wetland, if you've owned it for, I think, a certain length of time, now is, basically you can do this. And, without having to pay that, the 75 cents added up to an awful lot of money. Like this,
I believe he did get a
42,000 square feet in an acre. And so if you were gonna disturb the acre, it's like, you know, it's $25,000-$30,000.
42,000, it's 0.75,
Huh?
Yeah, 30 grand.
30 grand.
But if you're disturbing, you're not disturbing at all.
No, you're just going through, but it encompassed the acre. But anyway, so, do these guys pay for the disturbances when they get a permit and put their solar panels up?
Yes, they do. So we're looking specifically at where they're putting the posts and where they're having to dig trenches, where they have to put in access roads and the like. Generally, they're not citing an area that is 10 acres of wetland. Typically, what we see is there's some wetland running through the tract of land, and they remove the panels that were going to be over the wetland area and have, you know, like two pieces of a solar array with fence around those and the wetland running through, which also serves as a wildlife habitat corridor, because the wetland itself isn't fenced.
Yeah.
So in those cases, they're able to avoid the fees by staying out of the wetland area, and that lowers their application fee.
Why I'm asking that question is they told us that, I believe they said the average payment to a farmer would be $1,000 per acre per year. And, you know, I own a little land up north there, and to fool around on a 10-acre parcel for 10 grand, I mean, I wouldn't let them in the driveway, because, you know, they'd be more trouble than it would be worth in revenue. But anyways, that's only my personal opinion. Go ahead. I mean, what I'm not, I guess, understanding is they want to do solar panels in wetlands or incorporate wetlands into their plan. They only want to pay me a grand an acre to rent the land, but yet they're willing to pay 75 cents a square foot if they pool in an acre, you know, if they pool in the wetlands. So, yeah, there's something a little wrong with that picture.
Well, I think that solar, generally, they're not paying for the whole acreage as an impact. I'm trying to pull up one of our permits right now. You know, I'm looking at a permit application that was under $400. Because we're looking at the actual posts and not the entirety of the site, only where there are impacts specifically in wetland or buffer zone areas, that ends up reducing the cost for them quite a bit.
Yeah.
Compared to a developer who's, you know, putting in a driveway, long driveway through a wetland area, that whole part of the driveway would be considered impact and require a permit.
Okay, do you, and then, like, if they had to put a post in the wetland, the only thing they'd get charged for is the footprint of that post?
Yes, if it's in an agricultural use, if they were to say they wanted to cut down a forested wetland, there would be impacts from cutting the forest, and that would all require a part of the permit impact fee. However, they're not proposing within forested wetlands, and that has so much impact. It would be very hard for us to ever issue a permit for something like that.
Chris?
Or if we do this, I would imagine it would be not a blanket exemption, but a condition, here's, if you were developing solar in wetlands, here's how you would do it. And, there would be some criteria. And I gather the developers are able and willing to, for instance, do the installation when the ground is still frozen, so that you're not tearing up the wetland as you bring your rig in there to sink these posts and things like that. Do you imagine, does that make a big difference? And does that make it more protective of wetlands if there were sort of, here's how you must do it if you are putting solar in wetlands? Has there been any thinking along those kinds of conditions that would be protective of wetlands in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how our permits are written, is they have very specific conditions, doing the work during the dry season or under frozen ground conditions. What we've unfortunately seen is instances where one company gets the permit, hands it over to a different company who does the construction, who hands it over to someone else who does the actual rating and upkeep of the solar farm. So that needs to be a part of the discussion, as well as how do we make sure there's integrity across all the different users of the solar site. We have been conducting for the past 4 years, we've been monitoring 5 solar sites in Vermont where there were solar arrays placed in wetland. We're assessing the soils and the vegetation and such, and comparing that with adjacent hayland. We have 1 more year of that study, and with that information, we'll be able to better say what the difference is between wetland under a solar array versus wetland that is hayfield, and some ideas of what to suggest for best management practices if that is the direction that solar is going.
Is that 1 more growing season? So you'd have those final results this fall?
Yes.
Or next?
Or this fall, the 2022.
So next session, whoever was here would have the benefit of that report to kind of look at to see if there was problems or not.
Correct. And we are, hopeful that we can get information from other solar farms as well, because 5 isn't a very big sample size. And having more information from other arrays throughout Vermont would really help us.
Other questions for Peter? Pete, do you have any comments on what we talked about?
No, I mean, we have concerns, with this going into agricultural areas. I sense the solar developers are keen on being able to get an exemption to be able to use these lands, to work in cooperation with certain farmers to use these lands. But we do have, right now, we have the one exemption for growing food and crop, because as Laura has indicated, if that stops for whatever reason in the future, through contracting with NRCS or others to be able to set those lands aside, the wetland will in fact recover. It's, we're not sure with the solar use or other industrial uses. And so we do have those concerns. And we'll continue to work with the solar industry and looking at language or looking at ideas they have for that. But again, it's sort of, that would be a major step in granting that industrial use, that exemption. And I'm sure there are other folks that would like to be able to get a similar exemption, and I'm sure they'll take notice as well. So we'll work with them. Laura's study is wrapping up, as she indicated, this coming fall. That will provide some interesting information for us, and we continue to work with them, with the solar industry. As Laura indicated, we have issued permits. We've reviewed a lot of sites. Sites have been installed successfully by avoiding wetland impacts. So
well, we don't want to, open the box up and our farmers work hard to work with you folks to be able to farm their land. We don't want to mess any of that up. And of course, we've done about anything and everything to promote growing your own food here in Vermont, and got a lot of new small farms coming along. And do you require them to mow these solar fields so that it doesn't grow up to brush and bad lands? Because a field just sitting idle, it'll sit there for a while, but then you start getting little trees and I mean, we don't want to look like our friends across the Connecticut River.
Yeah, so generally in part of their application, they tell us what their mowing regime is, which might be once a year. We have one site where there were some problems with the mowing regime because there were invasive plants and they were mowing when the seeds were setting, which made the 90% of the solar array covered in invasive plants, and we've been working with them on reducing those invasives, which could potentially be a problem if someone wanted to farm that area later. We do have one solar farm that I know of that is specifically allowing woody vegetation to grow up in between the panels. We had always thought that it was incompatible, but it appears that it is, and there's bird habitat in between the solar arrays and wildlife forage in those areas. I know that this year, it's been like 3 years, and this coming year, they're going to have to go in with pruning shears to cut the tops of those shrubs because they're starting to impede on the ability to catch solar. But it appears that there's potential for people to manage their solar arrays with woody vegetation in between.
Any other questions from the committee? Anything else from you folks that you'd like to explain to us or tell to us? If not, Laura, could you put us on the list of receiving that report when you get it done next fall? So, well, Senate Ag Committee. because we don't know if we'll be back or not. Our job isn't the most secure. So, but anyways, thanks a lot for your time this morning. Sorry that we were running late, but we're doing the budget today, and I think you folks have quite a lot of money tied up in that. So probably you didn't mind us being a little late as long as you were getting your share of or what you needed to operate with. And so thanks a lot, and we'll probably will have you back next year. Somebody will, to talk further about this in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for your time, Chairman Starr and the other senators. And yeah, we appreciate it. We're happy to come back and talk more about this whenever you'd like. So thank you.
Yep. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.
So is Maddie on?
And Graham.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good morning, Maddie.
Good morning, Senator Starr. Good morning, everyone.
Have you put your solar panels up yet?
No, not yet, and I'm wishing I
Have
would have.
18 going up tomorrow. Got 40 up already and 18 more tomorrow.
Morning, Graham. So, we've got you folks on to chat about, I don't know if you want to talk about your legislative priorities or solar panels. But we're, we're open to hear more about your legislative priorities, both from NOFA as well as rural Vermont. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having us. I will give you a heads up that I have been intermittently losing power this morning. So if that happens again, I can call back in on my landline. I do have. And yeah, I guess I would just say it feels like there felt like a really particular need to sort of come in and try to bat some cleanup this session. I would just say overall, there are a lot of bills that I should introduce myself for the record also. I apologize. Maddie Kempner, Policy Director, Rural Vermont, or Rural Vermont, NOFA Vermont. Looking at you down there, Graham. Yeah, there are a lot of bills that have sort of come to our attention and I think gained a lot of steam this session a little bit late and a little bit unexpectedly to us. And so I think that, from my perspective, at least, there is a need to sort of come in and speak to a few bills that we have not had the opportunity to speak to you all about yet, and just sort of address some things that are as of yet unresolved this session. A few things that I want to just speak to you all about, some of which I think, you all have the capacity to directly act on, and some of which you may not at this point, but just want you to know sort of where NOFA stands on them. One is S268, the Right to Farm bill, which I know the House has continued to take significant testimony on, the House Ag Committee. I want to speak a little bit to your efforts to fund wash pack stations and other infrastructure for diversified producers. I want to speak a little bit to H626, the Clean Heat Standard, and the Surface Water Bill. So I've got a list. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible to make sure that there's time for Graham, but just want to give you all a heads up. Those are some of the issues I wanted to mention. And I just want to say overall around a lot of these bills, it feels to me like, and this may be in part just the nature of, working in the legislature, but there really is sort of a trend that I'm seeing that we are working on a lot of bills that are addressing problems sort of at the end point, rather than addressing them upstream and in a way that sort of prevents issues from happening later on. And I can touch on that as I get into a little bit more, but in general, a lot of the bills that we're looking at, I think, would really benefit from just a better process and a more inclusive process to bring in all stakeholder voices. And again, addressing some sort of upstream aspects. I want to start out with the right to farm bill, which I know is has not, actually been taken up by your committee, but there has been some testimony on the House side. And I think our take on this in general is it really would benefit from more discussion. We certainly, as NOFA, want farmers to be protected from frivolous lawsuits. I hope that goes without saying. But we are also concerned about expanding the right to farm to a point where we really create a race to the bottom. And I think it's important to consider the long-term implications for all of agriculture. If we create a situation in Vermont where there's no recourse or very little recourse to address real environmental issues stemming from farm practices, the implications of that, and the outcomes of that for all of agriculture could actually be really damaging. So I just want to say that concern to you all. I also just want to share, in speaking with some folks from our board and folks farmers that we work directly on policy with at NOFA, that there's a concern that the needs of organic farmers have really not been considered in these discussions. Organic farmers make up a really significant portion of our industry and a really significant portion of the farms in Vermont in general. And in particular, the right to farm free from chemical trespass is really important to organic producers, because chemical trespass from things like herbicide application on a right of way or drift from a neighboring farm can directly threaten an organic farm's certification status, which has real economic impacts for that farm. So I don't think that's a part of the conversation, that's been had at this point. I also just think there may be more effective ways to limit frivolous lawsuits, and I think those avenues would benefit from more conversation as well. If there's a legitimate cause for concern about increasing nuisance lawsuits, I think, I don't know if you all were able to catch Matt Strasberg from the Vermont Ag Mediation Center, spoke to House Ag last week and made the suggestion that, both in some states, both parties are required to go through a mediation process before a lawsuit can proceed. I thought that was a really interesting suggestion that could benefit from more exploration. I also want to note that many members of the House Ag and Forestry Committee expressed not knowing that his organization existed at all. And I think that's really telling that, mediation could be a service that is available to a lot of the parties that would be involved in these types of lawsuits that folks are not aware of. And his services are also available for free because his organization is funded by the federal government. So cost is not a barrier to folks accessing that. But I think if that were a requirement prior to people engaging in these lawsuits, we might see a lot fewer of them, and we might really see more meaningful resolution of these disputes between neighbors in general. So I also think, potentially just including the provisions of 268 that pertain to legal fees could be an effective deterrent as well, in that, if plaintiffs are required to pay the legal fees of the defendant, if the defendant prevails, that could be a significant barrier as well. That could be effective. So those are just some thoughts on that. I hadn't had a chance to share with you all. I do want to say I don't know much about it, but I appreciate your work to get some funding to producers to support wash and pack station upgrades for vegetable producers. If this is being done through the Produce Safety Grant program that previously existed and had funding through the Agency of Ag, that's a great solution, particularly for vegetable farmers, but it may not cover other types of infrastructure that we've been talking about, like cold storage and commercial kitchen upgrades. So I'd love to just continue to work on that with you all going forward, because those other types, like cold storage and commercial kitchens, are really important infrastructure for other types of producers like livestock and value-added producers as well. Not a lot of time. I know. Are you all wrapping up at noon?
Pardon?
Are you all planning to wrap up at noon?
Hey,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure. I'll try to be quick. I think Graham is planning to speak a little bit more to this, and maybe Graham, I'll just let you speak to H626, the neonic treated seed bill. I just want to say, I think BMPs for the use of neonic treated seeds should really be looked at as a bare minimum. It just makes sense. And we've actually been told that the Agency of Ag has already drafted BMPs for these seeds. So we're not really clear what the barrier is to those being finalized. And I also just wanted to flag for you all, I would urge you to invite Earl Ransom to speak to your committee. I don't know if anybody knows Earl, but he owns Stratford Organic Creamery down in Stratford and is on the Ag Innovation Board. And he could actually speak directly to his experience growing corn without the use of treated seeds. So that might be something that you could look into hearing from him.
You know, if you think about the last 2 years, you know, in general, you know, we've been here in Montpelier since after town meeting, we came back. We left just before town meeting or just after town meeting 2 years ago. So, you know, we've been gone for basically 2 years. And it's a real bummer to work on sort of deep issues, not being together. And like the right to farm bill, if we really want to get that passed and in the future, get it over and done and passed, what we've got to do is do a committee bill in agriculture to do that. You know, if you have Joe Blow from East Overshoe introduce a bill in general and it goes to the Senate clerk, if it deals with judicial issues, he's gonna dump that in judiciary. But if you do a committee bill and you do it in ag, nobody can get that away from you until you get done your work on it. So I just wanted to let you know that in the future, if we're going to do a right to farm bill, it ought to get started in the ag committee as a committee bill. And you know, I think we as a committee, I don't know about for sure on the House side, but we've done a lot for small farmers. We got, you know, we did get a bunch of money for these organic farmers to upgrade their driveways and to change out a bulk tank if need be for every other day pickup instead of everyday pickups. And I think for where we came from and where we're ending up, we haven't, I mean, maybe we haven't done real good, but we haven't done bad either. And if we were here working every day all winter, I think the things would look better. But anyways, we'll move on to Graham, see what rural Vermont's up to and what they'd like
just
to.
quickly, before we move on to Graham, not that I don't want to hear from Graham, but I'm wondering, Maddie, what your quick take is on the water withdrawal bill.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Senator Polina. I'll be super quick. We are really concerned about it. I don't think there is a vegetable or fruit grower in the state who's not concerned about it. And this is another example where, you know, this bill really needs to be taken up by your committee. We needed more meaningful input from the ag community from the very beginning, including in the study committee that initiated this bill. And, you know, I think also the failure to acknowledge, from what I've seen at least, the necessity of food production as a, you know, compared to things like golf courses and the ski industry, which we understand are sort of permitted separately under this program, under a different program, but acknowledging the particular need of food producers and the necessity of food production in any type of, you know, reporting requirements or permitting requirements for surface water feels critical and feels like something that's really been left out of this bill. So yeah, we could say more, but that's what I'll say for now. Thanks for asking.
Thanks.
And yeah, just to let you and Graham know, that bill's going to be headed in this direction, hopefully this afternoon. So, but I don't know if there's any fix to it, but if you guys have got constituents that know really what that needs so that it is acceptable, we really need to hear about it. So we can try to work it out if we can, because it's going to be it isn't gonna be good if we can't fix it and don't send it back to the, the whole floor, because it isn't our bill to start with. We're just gonna get it to work on. So, talk to your constituents and see what would make it work for them. And really, nothing is not the answer. That would be like my answer, but
Study committee, task force.
maybe there's something that
Ryan Hatch was on
it
there.
could be fixed. But anyways, let's move on to Graham, because we don't want to cut into his lunch hour. Morning, Graham.
Good morning, Senator. As always, appreciate the little bit of humor you throw in here. It's Graham Uniting-Strufenacht, Policy Director at Rural Vermont. Thanks, Maddie, for speaking to all those issues. I know you all only have a couple minutes left, and that's fine. It was interesting to listen to a little of the solar bill. Just as Maddie said, there's been so many bills that have popped up this session that we were and weren't expecting, that we've had to track. It's been hard to pay attention to all of them and give them the due diligence we need to. I would just second what Maddie.
There's no solar bill, by the way, Graham, just the beginning of a conversation there. So
okay,
that's not going to be a bill, I don't think.
No.
Thank you, Senator. I just second what Maddie said about, in general, I think we're going to see an increasing number of bills which hit at this intersection of environmental health and, the working class agrarian economy, whether you're a forester, whether you're a farmer, et cetera, and needing to really bring all people to the table to think about this in the era of climate change and make sure the additionalities of people in particular are understood. And I think I'll go straight to the surface water bill that Senator Polina was asking about. I've watched all the testimony, I believe, taken on that bill and provided testimony myself last week before it left committee. And in terms of your specific request, Senator Starr, I think that I know you've had Justin Rich in from Veg and Berry, and you've had some people in. I would just suggest, the Veg and Berry Association, and I said this to the Natural Resources Group, this is an association which rarely takes political stances. It directly represents more than 425 vegetable and berry farms in Vermont. They primarily work with farmers through a peer-to-peer support network. It's a really powerful listserv and network. And to see them come out and to see them speak to this issue, I think says a lot about the challenges they see. And it also says a lot, this bill, I think, about just the difference in perspective different communities are bringing to this. As I heard Senator Pearson say, there's been a study committee. Ryan Patch from the agency was on that study committee. There was a hemp farmer on the study committee. Some folks have said that's adequate agricultural input on that committee. But when I talk to a number of farmers, they look at the list of people on that committee and feel like, oh my gosh, we had no representation there. So there's going to be a dramatic difference to some extent in how we approach these issues. And that's why with this and others, it's really important that everyone's brought in from the very beginning. It's one thing for a ski area or a golf course to have a highly capitalized business, for example, to have the ability to build an impoundment pond, pump during the wettest times of the year, and then be able to feed out and not take water during the driest. But for a lot of smaller farms and the vegetable and berry farms impacted, these are not highly capitalized businesses. As you know, these are folks who are on the economic edge. You heard from Suzanne Long last week in our Small Farm Advocacy Day. She's had this reputation as one of the most successful small organic vegetable farms in the state and remains on Medicaid. Folks remain on the edge. That positionality, I think, just continues to not necessarily be recognized in a lot of this climate change work that we're doing. And if we really want to understand a really granular level detail, for example, of surface water withdrawal analysis down to the 5,000 gallon threshold that they were seeking, then we really need to ask, what do the communities who are going to be asked to provide that data need, and bring them on from the beginning to understand that. I think the other side of this equation for surface water, or one of them, is that there's, as Maddie said, how do we approach this holistically? This is just about the withdrawal side, but how are farms using water and what are they using it for? So if we're discreetly irrigating with drip irrigation at the soil surface in order to feed biological activity, to grow food and to grow life in the soil, to replenish the water table, that's a different thing than some of the more industrial uses of surface water withdrawal, including even just spraying it into the air. Similarly, if you're watering livestock, if you're basically fertigating the landscape that water is coming from originally in very discrete amounts, feeding photosynthesis. So there's this whole question of how water is being used, which hasn't been addressed, as well as the general positionality of the different populations are going to be impacted. So I just encourage you to bring in as many people to hear on that issue as possible, and not just us organizations, but farmers. I have yet to hear a farmer in the veg and berry community or otherwise speak in support of this bill. And the last thing I'll just say on it is that the concerns are also real. I think Jeff Crocker from, I don't know if it was DEC or the Agency of Natural Resources, gives really compelling testimony about why it's important to monitor these withdrawals. At the same time, we just made, the impacts are really challenging for the farm community. And you have some people saying that you're asking me to register and report when I have millions of gallons flowing by my home every day. And it just doesn't seem like it's a scale appropriate regulation. So I don't have an immediate solution. I recognize that Natural Resources has made a lot of changes, but I'm happy to provide testimony and continue to listen to testimony from farmers in their committee. I know we're over noon here. I'm not sure what you all want to do going forward. I'll just say that Caroline's not able to be here today, but H501, which is the compost foraging and plastics bill, is in Senate Natural Resources. And she just wanted to make sure that you all know it's there, that it needs your support, that the committee has a lot of things going on, and we just need to make sure this bill gets through. It's been a lot of work, and I think it's one of those rare places where you see the agricultural and environmental communities sort of coming together and some agreed upon steps forward. Like I said, I'm happy to speak more. I have a number of issues I'd like to talk about, but it's afternoon, and I'll defer to you, Senator Starr, just about how much time what you guys need to do.
Senator Pearson has a question. Green.
Yeah, by the way, these are all notes from veggie and berry farmers. So the word is out. On the surface water bill, I just would turn to you, as the chair said to Maddie, and say, we need your help. We need this bill in some fashion is likely to go forward. Where I sit is I want it to be absolutely not a hassle for farmers that, especially, I'm sympathetic to folks who've been doing this for decades. I also don't think the state should be blind to knowing where this is happening. These are public resources. And so to me, I would just sort of have a form. Yes, I take water from the river, or something really, really simple that just allows the state to understand that stretch of river has 40 people. That stretch of river has 2 people. We shouldn't be blind to it, but so I welcome just your help solving this riddle for us. It's not going to be easy, and we're not going to have a lot of time.
I think some recognition of, where those farms are and the fact that they irrigate, occasionally would be fine. I think that type of just like recognition of sort of who is out there, utilizing surface water makes sense. But in terms of just like, I think the conversation in Senate Natural Resources has been framed around like, just keep an easy logbook of how much you're irrigating and when, and it's just not that simple. There's drip irrigation, there's overhead irrigation. It's really, it could be get really onerous really quickly for producers. But I think on a very basic level, understanding where the water is being used would be fine. I think I just want to say, without though recognition, as Graham said, of sort of the distinction between this type of water use and sort of how it impacts the landscape overall and that volume of surface water overall is also really a critical starting point for farmers to feel like they're not at some point just heading down the road of some onerous permitting process. I think that's really like the underlying concern, as well as like, what is this type of reporting going to lead to eventually? And if there's not some acknowledgement about the essentiality of their water use from the get-go, farmers are going to be much more resistant to that. And the question that was posed to Justin Rich in his testimony last week, which was, do you pay for the water, does not give comfort, I think, to farmers that their use is being recognized as essential.
One real sad thing to understand, nobody knows even how many small farmers there are and where they are. Nobody knows where there's 460 small fruit and vegetable farmers. And first of all, we gotta find where these people are, and we don't have a clue. I mean, we've tried to get like the farm numbers to who was when we were doing the task force on, the revitalizing the dairy stuff. Couldn't come up with a definite answer to who they are or where they are. And so first thing before we start, I think wondering about water withdrawal, we ought to find out who we have and where they are. And I would think, just knowing a little bit about growing crops, that most of these are near a river or a brook because that's where the best growing land is. So that there should be all kinds of water available for them. But anyways, do you think, is there any way that we could, if we needed to get word out to these folks, that you'd be willing to help us kind of put on a map where our farms are so we could, we could show people, well, this is where the farms are located today compared to, 25, 50 years ago when they were everywhere. Because we don't know where they are and who they are actually. Especially farms under 50 cows, they don't have to register in or anything, dairy farms. But the organic guys, you represent a lot of them, right, Maddie?
Yeah, I was gonna say, we have some pretty good data on where all of the certified organic farms and processors are in the state.
And are you getting the word out that we've got money to help them with their driveway expansions and bulk tanks?
We are definitely happy to get the word out about that. We are also going to be working directly with the Dairy Business Innovation Center on sort of small grants, which I'm hoping can sort of work in concert with the funding coming from the state to support those farms in similar ways, because there are certain things, for example, that DBIC can't fund. They can't fund anything that's that's considered construction. So if farms need to make, upgrades to their barns or things like that, or their bulk tanks, I think even they can't fund those things, but there may be other things they can fund. So yes.
Somebody said they could do bulk tanks, but they couldn't do the construction. And our money you could use certainly for the construction to make it go further, and their money, because they've got 20 million, we only got 200,000 or something.
Right,
So
and they're also regional, so they're trying to, address lots of things across the region. But yes, we are working with them directly on that, and we are also happy to help get the word out about other funding.
Well, get as much of that as you can.
Are you all hearing about the surface water bill? I'm sorry, Graham, I just want to clarify. This afternoon, did you say? Because I'm wondering if I could reach out to some folks about that for you.
We think it's getting referred to the committee today.
Okay, this afternoon.
So
this afternoon at 4:30, if you watch the House proceedings, that should be on there.
But we wouldn't actually be talking about the bill today.
Yeah.
Right, and that would be tomorrow morning, potentially, or later this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be, and we've got a bill we got to vote out, but we don't really need to do that until Friday. So if we get the bill this afternoon like we're supposed to, we'll start work tomorrow on it, Maddie. Okay? So, well, thank you. Sorry that we didn't have more time this morning, but we were kind of tied up. Thanks a lot. And if you want to get on tomorrow, that's fine. Or you got any Barry people that want to get on, but let them know that we're going to be working. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else?
Also,
Yeah, well, we got other places to be at once, so Well, thank you guys, and
Thanks.